Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of What is This Book? Today we are talking about a book that has caused quite a stir in certain circles, and that is none other than the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a pseudepigraphal work attributed to the great patriarch Enoch, the grandfather of Noah. In this episode, we're going to look at exactly what the book is, its contents, why it's important, and why it was rejected by most Christian scholars. But before we get into all of that, if you enjoy these videos, then please click like and subscribe down below. By doing so, you will not only help me out, but you will also stay up to date with every new release. With that said, let us begin. So, what exactly is the Book of Enoch? Well, the title is actually somewhat misleading because the book is not just one single work, but rather a collection of different works written over a span of 300 years. These various texts were then compiled together around the year 100 CE. They contain a variety of different material, but some of the main themes include Enoch's ascent into heaven, angelic beings, fallen angels, and instructions for the righteous. One of the most popular sections is 1 Enoch 6, which says that the angels known as the Watchers fell in love with human women, and they took wives. It continues by saying that they taught them sorcery, magic, incantations, and the knowledge of plants and herbs, and it ends by saying that the Watchers had children by their wives, and they were the giants, the offspring of the fallen angels. There are many more fascinating stories found throughout the text. For example, in 1 Enoch 85:7, it says that the Lord spoke to his angels and commanded them to curse Ham and Canaan. Why? Because Canaan was Ham's youngest son who mocked Noah after he got drunk and exposed himself while completely naked. Another intriguing story comes from 1 Enoch 23, which describes how the fallen angel Azazel taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. In verse 9, it says that through the deeds of Azazel, the earth became corrupted before God, and there were great unrighteousnesses on earth because of him. This brings us to our next question, which is when did it originate? As we mentioned earlier, the material contained within the book was written over a span of 300 years. The first part, chapters 1 to 36, was written during the 3rd century BC. The second part, chapters 37 to 71, was written sometime between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century CE. And finally, the third part, chapters 72 to 82, was written during the 1st century BC. The reason why we know this is because of internal evidence within the text itself. For instance, in chapter 1 of the Book of Watchers, it says that these words came forth in the days of Jared, who lived an entire life in righteousness. We know from Genesis that Jared lived from 2200 to 2140 BC. This tells us that chapter 1 was written sometime after the 3rd century BC. On the other hand, in chapter 82, it speaks about a king named Ptolemy, who ruled from 283 to 246 BC. Therefore, this chapter must have been written after his death. So that gives us a rough idea of when each part was written. The next question we will answer is, why is this book important? Now, even though it was not included in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, it is still important for a few reasons. First of all, it was extremely popular among early Christians. In fact, Jude quotes it verbatim in Jude 14-15, and it is clear from church history that people like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others were familiar with the text. Secondly, it sheds light on the beliefs and culture of the time period in which it was written. It helps us understand the historical setting of the Old Testament and the intertestamental period. Lastly, it contains some interesting angelology and demonology. Even though these teachings are not orthodox, they do show us what people believed concerning angels and demons in those days. However, you might be wondering, if it was so popular among early Christians, why was it rejected? Well, the main reason was because it did not meet the requirements of being a canonical book. For something to become part of the Old Testament canon, it needed to be written in Hebrew and meet certain criteria laid out in the Torah. You see, in Deuteronomy 18:22, Moses writes, "When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and does not fulfill what he says, that prophet shall die the death. This passage was used as a guideline to test the validity of any new prophecy. If the prophet predicted something that did not happen, then he was disqualified from being a true prophet. So when someone wrote a book claiming to be Enoch, they would check to see if the predictions made within the book were correct. Another requirement is that it had to be written in Hebrew. The original language of the Hebrew Bible was Hebrew, so anything written in Greek or Aramaic was disqualified. Unfortunately, the Book of Enoch failed to meet both of these requirements. Most of the material was written in Greek and Aramaic, and none of it met the criteria laid out in Deuteronomy 18. But there is another reason why it was rejected, and this is the real reason. Early Christians felt that it was not necessary to have these books in order to understand the ones that were considered canonical. You see, the purpose of the Old Testament is to reveal God's plan of salvation. All of the books within the Old Testament point to Christ. They foreshadow him or speak directly of him. However, the Book of Enoch did not do this. Even though some parts were written before Christ came, none of them predicted his coming or spoke of him at all. To better illustrate this, let me ask you a simple question. Can you read through the entire New Testament and not hear anything about Jesus Christ? I think the answer is obviously no, you can't. But can you read through the Book of Enoch and hear nothing about angels, demons, fallen stars, giants, or the secrets of heaven? Again, I believe the answer is no. It does not teach salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. It doesn't speak about sin or the necessity of repentance. It doesn't contain any prophecies about Christ's first coming or his second coming. Now, I'm not saying that this book is bad or should be burned. Let me clarify what I'm not saying. I am not saying that this book should be discarded altogether. I believe that some of the material was written by Enoch and that it was written during the time period in which it says it was written. I'm not saying that people in the early church were wrong for reading it or quoting it. I believe that people should have access to this book and should read it if they want to study church history or the history of Israel. And I'm certainly not saying that everything found within its pages is incorrect. Some of the material is true, but it did not meet the requirements to be considered canonical. And if you are interested in learning more about books that were considered for the Bible, but were not ultimately included, I highly recommend you watch my series called Books That Almost Made the Bible. You can find it here on the channel. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. If you did, then please click like and subscribe down below. Thanks for watching. Until next time, shalom.